All right, so we're going to talk about animal behavior and think about home range and habitat use a little bit today. Make sure that you read chapter 5, which is going to go over a lot of material related to this as well. So when we're talking about behavioral ecology, we're basically talking about the ecological and evolutionary basis of animal behavior. And what I'm going to talk about today in this lecture is how behaviors affect decisions that animals make, and ultimately how those decisions or behaviors that they're engaging in can affect populations. So we start with an individual and scale up to population level dynamics. So one of the things that I think about a lot in my own research program is how things choose their diet. And you've probably heard these terms right here, generalist versus specialist. If I asked you which ones are generalist or specialist in this video or in this picture here, think about which ones you would pick. I think most people would probably agree that the panda is a specialist, right? So it's eating pretty much only one specific species or just a couple of species of plant within the same genus. So that's pretty specialized. Although we've talked about the anatomy of the bear has been constrained from an evolutionary standpoint where it isn't very efficient at eating that, it still is technically specializing on it, right? So what about the lynx here holding the hare? Their population is very tightly connected to the lynx populations because they're so specialized on that one prey item. We look at these other two, the coyote, for instance, that is a predator. So we typically, a lot of people might think of it as a specialist, but the reality is if you actually dig in the scat of coyotes, you'll find many different prey items, and they pretty often will prey switch based on whatever's easiest to catch or most convenient, or whatever is in the environment that can give them the energy that they need pretty easily. So just to give you an example, I've dug through, I don't know, countless amounts of scat. One of the most common things at any time of the year in their scat is actually persimmon seeds, which I always thought was pretty interesting. So that's a fruit, if you're not aware of what that is. But we'll find small mammals, deer hair, plant parts, so leaves, seeds, fruit parts, insects make up a huge proportion of it. So we have all these different prey items that they're using on the landscape, which makes them pretty extreme as generalists because they're eating so many different kinds of things. So that'd be called an omnivore. Even though this is a canid, it still is an omnivore in terms of its dietary habits. It probably would rather have a fawn or a small mammal than some of those other items, but frankly, those things are harder to catch and harder to handle. So sometimes it may benefit the animal to diet switch to these other things, like a berry on a bush, right? They might be very abundant for a species for a short amount of time, and coyotes will take advantage of that. Deer, they're primarily eating plant parts, right, leaves, but they also eat fruits, and they eat tons of different species of plants. So not really the same kind of specialists as we're seeing in this panda that's really restricted to the leaves of just a couple of species. The deer is pretty general in terms of its dietary choices, but it is still sort of specialized on plants. It is an herbivore, right? So the main point I wanted to make is this is, we try to put things into a box, whether it's a generalist or specialist, but really there's a continuum, and animals fall along that continuum, and where they fall along that continuum often changes with context in the population, with density and what's going on in the environment. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about it. One of the most successful ways that we've thought about foraging is through the optimal foraging theory. And this is basically just a couple, some mathematical models that predict how animals should behave in particular instances based on the idea that natural selection should favor animals selecting the diet that gets the most energy for the least energy expenditure. That's essentially what we're talking about. They'll maximize the amount of energy acquired per unit of feeding. Okay, so there are a couple of other things that can affect that. A minute ago, I mentioned search or handling time with coyotes, how it's harder to handle some of the prey, and searching time where it may take them longer to catch a small mammal than to just eat a fruit off of a bush, for instance. So both of those things are playing in to the cost that it takes an animal to use a particular resource. So something else that might affect it is how much you can eat. So this other graph over here with herbivores in particular, the quality of the food in terms of digestibility or other qualities of the food like lignin content can affect how much they can eat and how much they can digest of it. And that could also serve as a limitation or a cost for foraging. So I've been really interested in how animals choose to eat. Like, how does an animal know which plant to choose over another? And it turns out that even humans have a pretty strong innate ability. And I've talked about this quite a bit in my research with deer, showing how plastic their diet choices are, but how sensitive their body is and their choices are to their nutritional demands. I think I mentioned that in another lecture, but so they're pretty plastic. Something else that we talk about a lot is a functional response. And we typically think about this from the standpoint of a predator. And you're probably thinking about that coyote or the lynx from a couple of slides ago when I say predator. But keep in mind that herbivores are predators of plants. You know, insects are predators of each other and plants. You know, so there are a lot of contexts where this predator could play into this. Basically, what this model is showing is three types of responses that we could expect from a predator based on prey density. So as prey density increases, we have a type 1 response, which is not really that common in nature. And then once you understand what I'm talking about, you'll realize why. We're basically talking about how many predators will show up, right? So as we increase prey density, we just increase predator density linearly with that. There are some insects and things that reproduce really quickly that can take this type of approach, but it's not that common in nature in the grand scheme of things. The type 2 response, essentially what we're saying is, you know, when the prey density is low, it's really easy for the predators to all pour in, but at some point, there's so many prey that predators literally can't reproduce fast enough. You know, so we may already have some in the population and they all key in on the resource when it starts becoming widely available. But we get to this point where now we don't have that many in the environment anymore that haven't already zoned in on it, and the predators get satiated. So I talked about this with oaks in one of the discussions, I think, with the predator satiation hypothesis, and that's sort of what's going on right here with this is, you know, with something that's a long-lived, slow reproducing predator, it's pretty easy to satiate those predators. And ultimately, when we get out to these prey densities, you know, the higher prey densities mean more of that population of prey are going to escape predation. So it's a pretty important strategy, especially for a lot of our plants. So the most common one in nature is probably this type 3 response. And basically, when we were talking about the coyote, what we were talking about is that diet switching. That's what you're seeing in a model here. So think about this. Basically, when prey density is low, it's not really worth the predator trying to seek those things out, but then it becomes readily available in the environment and it's super energetic and low cost to get. So then we see that predator response. But again, we've reached some point where there, you know, reproduction has to continue to increase predator response, and the predators ultimately get satiated as a result of it. So you see this sigmoidal curve like this really commonly. So there are a couple of other things. I put some figures in here for you to look at, and there are a bunch in the book to think about. But basically, when we're talking about a predator specializing on when to switch to an alternative prey, basically it's explained by this graph. And what I'm talking about is a solid line is just showing you a hypothetical, the expected gain from prey one. So it's pretty high when we have high densities, right, relative to the profitability of prey two, which is that broken line. But basically what this is telling you is that the optimal forager should choose its diet based on the abundance of prey one, right? So if prey one is really not very abundant, it's more profitable. You see this little region right here, it's more profitable for the predator to eat prey two until it reaches this threshold in density, and now it's more profitable to eat prey one. So the prey one in this case is the preferred prey, but profitability is depending on how easy it is to get those prey, right? So all this is telling you is that the preferred prey is dictating what the predator selects. It is not dependent on the alternative preys. So here are some other general things that we think about or predictions from this optimal model. So foragers should always rank food items based on their profitability, their energetic profitability, and I have the equation, the simple equation right there in parentheses. They should include the most profitable prey, but if it becomes less profitable, like we just saw in that figure, they should diet switch, at least if they have that capability. Not all species do, like that panda, right? They're pretty much constrained into that one food source, but they might change if something else became abundant or more profitable. So also the diet to include that less profitable prey is expected. What am I trying to say here? The forager should, I'll just read it. Forager should expand their diet to include the less profitable prey when the expected gain by specializing equals the profitability of the poorer prey. So basically that's a really convoluted way to say what I just said in that last figure where I showed you that, you know, there's some optimal point where the most profitable, you know, the profitable prey is not in high enough abundance to be profitable. So the diet switch occurs in that case. The decision to specialize or generalize is depending on the abundance, again, of that most profitable prey, not the abundance of the less profitable. And when I'm saying profitable here, I'm really talking about preference, like which one is the preferred prey, which is generally because it's most profitable. Another thing, I love this picture, although it looks like that's probably grabbing his tail, but I don't think it actually is. So yeah, basically you should go big or go home. The optimal forager should go all or none. And that doesn't happen that often in nature, but this is a prediction of this model. And there's some problems with this model because it's so simplistic, right? It's not taking into account all of the other reasons that foraging might change in nature. So keep that in mind. There have been some really awesome experiments to kind of show some of the issues with this model. And one of them is with this bird species. It's been pretty widely studied, but what they were trying to show is, okay, we've got these profitable prey and less profitable prey, and they're trying to see how this bird could discriminate between the two. And they literally put them in this little box with a conveyor belt, and they were do different speeds to see, you know, how handling time was affecting its choice between the best prey and the smallest or the least prey. And they found some really cool stuff. Some of the predictions of the optimal model had some problems. So in particular, one of those problems, and you can read that little section when I provide you the slides for this, one of the problems is that there's often partial preference, and it makes sense in nature that this should happen. So basically think about it this way. we have our preferences in the environment, but the environment's constantly changing. So it makes sense that we would want to sample things in the environment to kind of reassess and make sure everything is still good. So when they did that conveyor belt study, that's exactly what they saw. The rate of encounter of the big prey, which is the more profitable prey, was dictating how much of their diet was one or the other. So they talk about this at great lengths in the book. So hopefully that will clear that up if you're not understanding what I'm saying. But basically, imperfect discrimination, you know, when we turn up that dial, it's making it harder to discriminate between what's good and bad, and we end up with this partial preference being magnified in that system because handling handling time is increasingly becoming more restricted as you give them less time to handle the prey. So again, this is a really simplistic view, and there's a lot of evidence that, you know, we don't just have a static nutritional demand. This is actually something that my work with deer shows pretty clearly. Deer constantly have changing nutritional demands and a huge variety of plants that have very different nutritional values in the environment. And what we see is their diet selection is constantly changing to include some plants and not others based on their dietary needs at a given time. Another thing that was really interesting about that is it's just as important to reduce the abundance of superabundant nutrients so that you don't reach toxicity as it is to maximize the limiting nutrient. That's something that the optimal diet model they didn't consider to begin with, but is definitely pretty important. One of the big ones that we really pick on this model about is it doesn't really take into account predation risk and all of the effects that predators can have on prey and their choices. So if you're thinking about an herbivore choosing plants, having to worry about whether or not they're going to get eaten by a predator is a pretty big concern, and it's much more important than making sure they have a balance of nutrients in their diet, because it's a more ultimate fitness consequence. So something else that happens, and it's illustrated really beautifully with this example from beavers, is when you increase the diversity of food items, it increases handling time. And what you're seeing right here is exactly that happening. When beavers had access to the single species, you can see the density of aspen saplings there on the x-axis. The number of saplings that they were able to cut was increasing pretty well with the density until there's too many, you know, they've eaten as much as they can eat. When you have multiple species of saplings, that rate of intake is far less because they're not able to specialize on it as well. This is a pretty simple example where this linear programming model works really well. And I think I talked about this with this example with moose in the other lecture. But if you think about the constraints on this moose, basically it has some minimum energy that it needs to take in. It also has nutrient requirements. Sodium is a really important limiting one for this particular species. And then they also have a digestive constraint. So just think about it this way. If I kept giving you pizza, you can only eat so much because you just can't fit any more inside, right? That's kind of what I do when I have pizza. I just fit as much as I can possibly get inside. So that's what we're talking about here. Basically, the animal cannot eat more than that. So for moose, they have to balance all of these requirements by eating aquatic vegetation, which is typically high in sodium, with terrestrial vegetation, which doesn't have much sodium normally, but is often higher in energy. So they have to balance that intake with those two constraints. So they have to eat more than that of sodium, more than this of energy, but they can't eat more than they can intake based on that digestive restraint. So basically, the animal should eat a mix of aquatic and terrestrial plants that gets them into this little triangle of space right here. So it actually works pretty well in this species. But again, think about, you know, the main limitations to those populations are driven by diet and not necessarily by other external factors like predators, like they would be with smaller ungulates. So another key concept that they talk about in the book chapter quite a bit is optimal patch use. So at some point, you know, let's think about a squirrel in an oak tree. At some point, it eats most of the acorns in that tree, and it needs to move on to another oak tree. So what we're talking about here is basically the marginal value theorem as part of it. So it's optimal patch use. And if we think about this patch, essentially the energy gain from that patch versus the energy expenditure to move on to another patch is this line right here. And what we should expect is when this curved line touches that line right there, we've essentially gotten to the point where the animal should have, it's the cost of moving is not as great as the cost of staying and trying to continue to gather acorns. So it should move on to another patch. Now, another thing that factors into this is not just distance. Remember, the squirrel probably also doesn't have a perfect knowledge of where the next patch is. So some of that factors into the cost. But basically what we call that point is the marginal value. So this marginal value theorem has some predictions. Basically, the forager should leave the patch when the rate of intake hits that threshold. So the forager should also leave a resource poor patch, so one that has less energy value to begin with than a resource rich. I mean, some of these things seem pretty obvious, I'm sure, but they're important to formulate when we're thinking about these hypotheses. And also the average distance between the patches is pretty important. We've actually made this, we've applied this concept to habitat management, and for a lot of species. One of the things that you might have heard about is called a giving up density. It's actually a really good way to measure how the value of a patch is affected by predation risk, but we more commonly use it to the GUD, so to speak, to monitor quality of wetlands for waterfowl. And basically it's just taking in how much energy is available in that wetland and how many duck days that you might get. So how many days can a duck spend in that before it depletes those resources? So we can use that value to determine how valuable is the patch and use that to inform how we manage that wetland patch. So this was a really cool experiment. Again, this is a really well-studied bird, so there are lots of cool examples of animal behavior from it. But basically what we're showing here is they were in an aviary, and they actually had these little containers that they put caps on that had food, different amounts of food, and a cap that was a different complexity to get off. And exactly what we should have expected is that the time in the patch sort of has this relationship with how long it takes them to get to the next patch. So those are definitely interacting to affect the choice to stay or move from the patch. Okay, so time in patch just means how long did it stay there based on how much does it cost the animal to move on to the next one. Another issue that commonly arises in nature is thinking about social behavior and also things that are influenced by density. So things that change as density changes, we would call density dependent. One of those things is habitat selection. Habitat selection is very much influenced by density of animals, and I want to show you why right here. So if we think about the quality of a patch, in habitat 1 is generally much higher quality than habitat 2. The problem with looking at it like that is that even though habitat 1 might be much higher quality than habitat 2 when there's one individual, when we take into account how much the individuals in the population are taking away from that habitat, the quality of habitat 1 at this density, so at 80 or whatever that is actually similar to the quality of habitat 2 when there's one individual, right? So they're actually equally suitable at different densities. And that's something that's pretty important for you to understand, that habitat quality is density dependent and influenced by density. And it makes sense, right? If you keep adding people to the buffet line, eventually that buffet line is not very profitable for each individual because there's so many taking food from it, right? Or other resources. It doesn't have to be food. So what we should see is we should see more animals typically occurring in habitat 1 than in habitat 2. And if that's the case, then density would be a pretty good indicator of what quality is, right? If that is occurring, what we would call that is that species is occurring spatially in an ideal free distribution, all right? So basically what we mean by that, let me explain it to you in my little cartoon graphic. If we have 3 patches, A, B, and C, and we have 1 food item in A, 2 in B, and 3 in C, right? So now we just think this one is 3 times as good as that one, and this one's 2 times as good as patch A. What we should expect in an ideal free distribution is for them to associate with those resources with a relative density that's similar, right? So we end up with 1 with the 1 food item, 2, and so forth. So that would be an ideal free distribution. Some species do conform to that well, but it doesn't take into account some other things that are problematic in a lot of populations. It's not just about density. In particular, if we have social behaviors where they're dominant individuals, they may be defending a territory, that would be called an ideal despotic distribution. And that's based on this idea that the most dominant individuals are going to choose the best possible habitat, and then everybody else sort of has to choose between what's left, right? So the dominant individual is not normally making up the majority of the population. The subordinate individuals are, and in that case, density would actually predict the quality of the patch incorrectly. So basically, one of the predictions about this kind of distribution is that there will be disparities in food intake, and the ones that are most dominant will fare best, and then others will not. You know, they may have a higher mortality risk or less reproductive success or whatever, because they have suboptimal habitat and a higher density often. Another thing that happens pretty commonly is interference, where you have even individuals within a species or multiple species competing for the same food, and that can drive patterns that don't fit that ideal distribution very well. The general take-home point of that is that density is a misleading indicator of habitat quality, and that's not for all species, but it is very commonly misinterpreted, and that's pretty important because we spend a lot of effort trying to determine what is high quality for animals, and that seems really straightforward. But when we start thinking about the fact that they may not actually be associating themselves with the best quality habitat, that can be pretty problematic for us from a management standpoint to try to determine what actions we need to take. All right, so make sure that you read the book chapter, and look forward to seeing you all in the discussion. I'm going to go ahead and end it here because I know that I've already used almost a half hour of your time. So appreciate you listening, and see you all soon.